So hotspots are really sites and mechanisms of identification and sorting. So really the idea is having the swift division between those eligible for protection and those who are not at the point of arrival in the EU. And I guess from the perspective of the EU, you can see that makes sense. Like from the start, we want to make this division, like, you know, who should we protect and who we shouldn't. But of course, that's hugely problematic. Because it becomes a distinction between people that might be eligible for transit, for relocation, and on the other hand, people that are rejected and might be deported. So there are now hotspots in operation in some of the islands in Greece, as we already heard this morning, as well as in Lampedusa and Sicily in Italy. And really what we've seen is that these places have increasingly become places of detention and of pushback. And that includes a number of rights violations, but I think are really not sort of accidental to these hotspots, but integral to the ways in which they have been organized and the ways in which they are running. So I think that really poses some fundamental questions to that system itself, to the mechanism itself. First of all, what we've seen is that that sorting and that identification is done often on the basis of nationality rather than on the basis of individual stories. And you can see that sort of in a very physical way as well. When people arrive in the port, they might just be separated out. Whether they're from Syria, Afghanistan, or Iraq, or sometimes Eritrea as well, they literally go in one line, and other people sort of go in another line. And people are denied access to the asylum system. We heard that about Greece this morning as well, through various mechanisms such as forced and exclusionary registration procedures, which includes forced fingerprinting as well. And often a lack of information about procedures. And this is something I want to speak about a little bit more. If you look at the ways in which those procedures have operated in Sicily, you can see that at work, how people are actually already given an expulsion order before they've actually had a right to claim asylum. So again, they're putting in line and they are being identified straight away. And this, I don't know if this is still happening in all different places, but it certainly happened for quite a while, that they would come to an officer and they would be given a multiple choice question in Italian, so it was often actually the officer who would fill it out for them. And there was a question as, what is the reason for you coming to Italy? And there were 4 possible answers to that. The first one was to work. The second one is to escape misery. The third, to escape for other reasons. And the fourth one was for family reunification. So fleeing persecution wasn't on the list. That probably would be other reasons, but how do you know, right? So this was already, of course, really, really problematic, because if you have the wrong nationality and you give the wrong answer to this question, then basically that's 2 strikes and you're out, right? And of course, these procedures are always, not quite straightforward. But we've spoken to a lot of people who were then actually put often in different temporary places. Sometimes that might just be in sports hall and so on. And in the middle of the night, they were all taken out. They were given a piece of paper. They had no idea what that piece of paper said, because again, it was in Italian, and pushed onto the streets. Now, that was an expulsion order, and it was what's been called the 7-day decree, meaning they had to leave the country at a particular airport within 7 days. And that was it. But I mean, it was in Italian, so they often had no idea what that even meant, and they hadn't been given access to the asylum system at all, and they were basically on the street in Sicily, having no idea what was going on. So that's been, I think, one of the issues with that. You see that sort of very clearly, people literally pushed on the streets. And also, I mean, of course, there's no way for them that they can actually leave the country either, right? So they just often end up on the streets. And of course, there are organizations and activists on the ground who try to help them and try to sort of still get them back into the asylum system. But you can see the issues here. And then finally, again, this was already mentioned this morning as well, is that hotspot centers, both in Greece and Italy, have actually, by default or in effect, become detention centers. And that's problematic in its own right, but also what that's meant is actually civil society organizations and other activists it's increasingly difficult for them to get access to these places and actually see what is going on, which is, of course, usually problematic as well. Okay, I want to move on to the more informalized spaces of transit. And again, we see also sort of increasing violence there over the past year, which includes heavy-handed police interventions, including destruction of living spaces, which again is often justified on the basis of people being illegal or irregular. Right. So, for instance, we've seen part destruction of the jungle in Calais. I'll speak a bit more about that as well. But also, for instance, in school in Paris, Lycée Jean Carré, we were just a few days before the eviction, before, nobody really knows, 700,000 people got evicted from there. We also saw, which is actually quite interesting, when we went to Milan, and we were told, oh, okay, most of the migrants are sort of in the parks and in the railway station as well. And this is often where they sort of congregate for a few days, get the railway tickets and then move up to other places. And when we were there was no one there. And we were like, well, what happened? But it was at the same time, it was also the expo in Milan. So the city had cleaned up, or sort of mayor had cleaned up the city, and they were sort of now pushed into a place sort of underneath the railway station. But actually, at that point, actually, he'd invested some money in it, so it wasn't too bad. But it was really interesting to see that suddenly, sort of, this cleansing operation, and that the transit point is just gone. So yes, saying a little bit about the jungle in Calais, and I know Mata will be speaking more about that in a minute as well. But what we saw there, is first in January, again, it was kind of a clearing of a 100-meter strip, the police saying, well, actually, again, it's, sort of safety purposes and so on, so people don't get onto the road so easily, so have a buffer zone, as they called it. But really, it was just for them to have much easier intervention into the camp. So that was in January, and then in March, there was a destruction of the houses, the living spaces of 3,500 people. And that included also community spaces, educational spaces and so on, which initially the French authorities had said they would leave, but several of them were destroyed as well. And really what it does, of course, it hasn't pushed down the number. The number, especially in recent weeks, has grown. But before that, the number of people, the number of residents in the jungle remained the same. And really what it's just done is make people's lives much more vulnerable. And also actually exposed them much more to violence, which is now not only police violence, but it's also far-right violence as well. But I don't want to sort of end on this in this very negative and depressing note, although of course it is quite depressing in many ways. But at the same time, you do see people also sort of contesting these forms of violence, and despite everything people do, the jungle is still sort of a city. With all sorts of sort of, with schools, with community centres, and so on. And you do see people, if there's a buffer zone and the police wants to use that as a site of sort of violence and intervention, now it's sort of taken up as also a space of football games and sports games and so on, right? So I think we sort of need to look at that as well. On the one hand, we need to look at the vulnerabilities, but at the same time, we need to also think about the kind of agency of the people there. And I think I'll leave it at that.